So we're at part 3 of the macro module, and in this part we're going to look at recording a macro and assigning it to a button on the quick access toolbar. But this macro is different from the one that we recorded earlier on because it involves us creating a recording that we want to be available all the time in Excel, whenever Excel is open. So earlier on in the course, you looked at creating a template for the expenses form. So rather than us having to maybe educate other people in our department or remembering to click File, New, Personal Expenses form every single time, we can record those steps as a macro and assign them to a button up in the top left-hand corner in the quick access toolbar. However, there are certain considerations that you're about to discover when it comes to working with the personal workbook. So I'm not going to practice the steps involved because I do know them, but obviously if it's a process that you don't do if you're not completely comfortable with every step of it, do practice it beforehand. But I'm ready to now go and start recording. So I click on View and Macros and Record Macro. So let's call this New Expenses Form. Now this time, I don't want this stored in this blank empty workbook. I want this button, this macro that I will attach to the button, to work whenever anything is open in Excel. So basically Excel has to be open, but I want this macro to work at any time. So I need to store it in what's called the personal macro workbook. So here I'll put in a description, this macro creates a new expenses form using the template. And then click on OK. So we're now being recorded. We know that because we can see down here in the bottom left-hand corner the black squares appeared. So now we need to generate a new expenses form. So File, New, Personal, and then double click on Expenses Claim Form. And then we could click on Name to make sure that the minute somebody uses this button to generate the new form, they are taken to the name box straight away. So let's stop recording and let's test it out. Now obviously I can't leave it open I could leave this open actually to test it out, but it would be bad practice. It could get confusing. So let's close that down. And let's test the macro out. So let's click on Macros and View Macros. There's the macro in the personal workbook, New Expenses Form, and Run. Perfect. It generated a brand new Expenses Claim Form 1, and it's taken us to the correct cell for us to start typing our name. So how much quicker is that? Now, if I want to assign it to a button in the quick access toolbar, I need to go up to the arrow at the end of the quick access toolbar and go down to More Commands at the bottom there. Now, we need to change this area at the top so that we're choosing commands from macros. And there is your macro you've just recorded, so we can add that across. And we can change the image, for example, and we can also change the hover text. You know, when you're in all these products and you hover on buttons, you get hover text appear. Well, we can do both of those things by selecting it here on the right and modify at the bottom. So what image shall I go for? Well, something to do with money, I suppose, since it's to do with expenses. So I could go for, let's say, this one here. And the hover text is in the display name box. So here you can have spaces, New Expenses Form, and OK. And then we click on OK again. And you can now see at the end of my quick access toolbar, I've got a button that I've assigned the macro to. Now again, just to avoid any confusion, I'm going to close this file down. And you'll see that when I click on that button, rather than having to go to Macro, View Macro, Run, all I have to do is click once on this button and it's generated a brand new Expenses Claim Form 1 and taken me to the correct cell. Now, in a similar way to before, if you delete this macro, the button will remain, but it won't work. So if you wish to remove the button, you can right click and choose remove from the quick access toolbar. I'm going to leave it there for now though, because I may well use it again shortly. In the same way, if you delete this button, the macro will stay there. So let's now have a look at how we can edit, and more importantly, I would say delete macros that we no longer want to store in the personal workbook. One thing that I have just thought of actually, which I should say at this point because I'm worried I'll forget otherwise. So many people at the end of the day are in a rush to go home that they close Excel and they don't always read all the messages carefully enough. Now, let me show you exactly what I mean. So I've closed that down. I'm now closing Excel and we get this really important message here. Do you want to save the changes you've made to the personal macro workbook? If you click yes, the macros will be available the next time you start Microsoft Excel. This is really important. We've got to click on save. If we click don't save, I will have lost that macro that I've just done. And so often when I've given people the exercise on macros in my training courses, people don't read these messages carefully enough and they just click don't save and they lose their macro recordings that they've stored in personal. So let's click on save. Excuse me. And let's go back into Excel. Okay, let's just wait for Excel to open up. Okay, and go into a blank book. So there's my button. Let me test it out. Brilliant. There's my brand new expenses claim form 1. If you had clicked don't save, the button would be there, but it wouldn't work because your macro would not have been saved. So please, please be careful. Okay, so let me talk to you a bit more about this thing called the personal macro workbook. You see, if you now think, actually, I want to delete that particular macro, and you go to view, and then you go to macros and view macros. Yes, you can see it there, but when you click delete, it says you cannot edit a macro on a hidden workbook. You've got to unhide it using the unhide command. Now, what is basically going on here is that the first time you choose to store a macro in the personal macro workbook, it creates itself. It's a storage container for your global macros that you want to be available in Excel all the time, regardless of what's open. And the personal macro workbook lives in the Excel start folder. Every time you start Excel, therefore, the personal macro workbook is opened, but we can't see it because it's hidden in the background. It's not intended for us to work in. It's purely a storage area for our global macros. So to unhide it, we have to click view and unhide. Do we want to unhide personal? Okay, yes we do. We now know we're working in the storage container for our macros, our global macros, because of the word personal up here at the top. So because it's open, I can now go to view and macros and view macros, and I can delete that macro. Do I want to delete it? Yes, I do. But at this stage, it's very important that you save your change and that you hide personal again. Do not close personal down, because if you've made just a change to the macro rather than deleting it, it won't work because you've closed it down. It has to be open but hidden in the background. Now again, I'm going to close Excel, and it's saying, do you want to save what you've done to your personal macro workbook? Well, here, I want that macro to be deleted. I don't want it anymore. So yes, I need to click save in order to store that deletion. Let's go back into Excel, give it a few moments to open. And what you'll see is that my button is still there. But when I click on it, it cannot run that macro because it's not available. Okay, or macros may have been disabled. I click on OK. The reason I can't use it is because I've deleted it. When I go to view and macros, it's no longer there. So now let's get rid of the button by right-clicking and removing it from the quick access toolbar. So that's an introduction to basic macros. If you want to record a macro in a specific workbook, such as we did earlier on, the move up and move down macros, you can, and you can assign them to objects, not just arrows. You could have pictures, shapes of any sort. Alternatively, if you have a macro, a recording that you want to work at any time in Excel, in other words, it's a global macro, you need to make sure you store it in personal, but make sure again that you are aware that if you wish to edit or delete the macro from the personal workbook, you need to unhide it, perform your actions, and then hide it again. Okay, and do watch out for that message. Make sure, if you're really not sure, click on cancel and go and review what you've done. But I hope that gives you a starting point for you to experiment with some of your own macros. Anything that you do repeatedly, the next time you go to do it, try recording yourself doing it and see if it will work when you play it back as a macro. Good luck and all the very best.